And I think where the miracles are today sometimes happens when hope slowly rises up in people that have lost hope because of wounding and because of abuse and mistreatment in the church and in other contexts. Moment by moment, day by day, week by week, month by month, year by year, as in my story, hope comes back, revival begins to happen within an individual soul. And by revival, I'm not talking about Charles Finney or George Whitefield kind of revival, like let's all praise Jesus. I'm talking about like a heart that has stopped beating and the doctors put the paddles on them and it starts to come back to life and the blood starts to flow and the color starts to come back in. And when you have that kind of experience, a death of sorts, life can take on a whole new meaning.
Hey friends, welcome back to the Broken to Beloved podcast. If you're looking for compassionate conversations that provide practical resources to move toward healing and wholeness, this is the place for you. I wanted to share a short announcement that season 2 of the podcast is wrapping up in just 2 weeks. I'm planning on closing with office hours and would love to hear from you. You can send an email to podcast@brokentobeloved.org if you have a question or comment that you'd like to share or have answered. And then I'm going to take a short and much needed break. Today, we're talking with Michael Cusick about his new book, Sacred Attachment. Michael is a licensed professional therapist, spiritual director, speaker, and author. Having experienced the restoring touch of God in a deeply broken life and marriage, his passion is to connect life's broken realities with the reality of the gospel. The founder and CEO at Restoring the Soul, Michael formerly served as an adjunct professor at Denver Seminary and full-time professor at Colorado Christian University. He holds an MA in Biblical Counseling from Colorado Christian University and an MA in Counseling Psychology from the College of Education at the University of Denver. And now, here's my conversation with our new friend, Michael. Michael, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, Brian, it's so good to talk with you.
It's so good to see you again. We're here to talk about your latest book, Sacred Attachment, Escaping Spiritual Exhaustion and Trusting in Divine Love. I loved it, read it a couple months ago. Loved your opening story of visiting your aunt, Sister Anne, at the convent as a 4-year-old. You share this delightful story of your older brother sticking you inside the cabinet with the lazy Susan, meant to pass items back and forth, and it opens on, quote, the wrong side, right? So now you find yourself behind bars. You're having all kinds of reactions of, am I even supposed to be here? I'm going to be in trouble. And instead you find yourself wrapped literally in love. And then you write that your life changed that day, quote, because of an invitation to be held in loving connection. I loved that so much. And I actually read it to my confessional community last night, and they were just taken with it. And just, so I think they're all going to go get the book too. You have this idea, even at the age of 4, that it felt unprecedented, unacceptable. Imagine yourself getting in trouble and yet discover joy and delight and even dancing with the sisters. Would you tell us about how that experience changed you? I think it sets the table so beautifully for the work.
Yeah, well, thank you. That's a beautiful summary. And I just want to start out, there's always the pleasant introductions at the beginning, and it really is good to be here. But I'm a huge fan of you, huge fan of your ministry. What you are doing is, I think, one of the most important ministries that can be out there today, because
Thank you.
The people who are broken in religious community are often the ones that have the deepest hunger for God. And when we lose them, when they walk away, when they say, I can't belong anymore because it's not safe, it's just a tragedy. So, my story and your story is one of people being restored. And ultimately, that's why I wrote the book, is to give that hope of how God meets us in our brokenness. But to set the context even a little bit further, so, this Carmelite monastery is where these nuns have taken a vow of poverty, silence, chastity, and to withdraw from the community at large. So they are behind bars. When my aunt, when her own father died, my grandfather, who I never met, she could not attend the funeral because she had taken this vow. So 17 women who have not had much contact with the public, but through this grill, and who will never have their own children. And suddenly this 4-year-old comes through onto their side. And they just went crazy. And I have to be honest that I didn't have a conscious memory that I felt safe, but I felt it in my body. And psychologists and neuroscientists call that neuroception. And neuroception is when we have detected something, but without information that's come into our brain. It's more of a sensory experience. And so I sensed, I felt in my bones that this was a moment that I could exhale and I could just be a little boy. Because as I also share in that story, it was the same year that my uncle began sexually abusing me in some really severe ways. And somehow in God's prevenience, which means that God's ahead of us, not over us, that he's guiding us on a path. In his prevenience, he knew that there needed to be some kind of experience, some kind of encounter that would be embodied in me, that decades later, though I didn't have a cognitive memory of it, I felt it in my body. And so, yeah, they pushed the table out of the way and we did Ring Around the Rosie and maybe even Hokey Pokey. And I wondered so much when I was writing this if it was true that I called up one of the 3 surviving nuns, now in her late 80s, and I said, did this happen? And I could hear her smile through the phone. And she said, oh, yes, it did. And I did that with my nephews and nieces. And I was like, oh, so this was kind of a normal thing. You were really breaking all the rules, as nuns. And I've since found out that the Carmelites are the rule breakers. They're the ones that, because of their contemplative life, they've always leaned, long before there was a social justice movement or the social gospel, they've always leaned toward outreach and ministry through prayer and hospitality to the down and out, the disenfranchised, the broken. And so, it was very natural for them to do that to me. But that was where I first experienced a secure moment of being held by love. And, the last 5.5 decades have been me learning how to be held in love. So as I talk about in the book, I'm not done with this journey, and none of us ever get done with this journey. But as we learn to rest in the embrace of a God that just loves us and welcomes us and shines his face upon us, we become more and more deeply secure in our nervous system, as well as in our emotions, our mind, and our spirit.
Yeah. Thanks so much for sharing that. And I want to get into that secure attachment and all of these things in a minute. What was it like for you to discover as an adult that maybe this wasn't so unprecedented or unacceptable, but actually maybe kind of normal for them?
It made me chuckle because those nuns, they were playful. They were easily delighted. I found out decades later in my 20s that these nuns were huge Cleveland baseball fans. So at the time they were called the Indians and now the Guardians. I happened to be in Cleveland last week and I thought so much of this, but that they would, like, every game, 152 games during this, or however many home games there were, they would gather together in what they called the parlor and probably turn down their either radio or black and white television, because they would always say no to the things that were lavish. And they would know the players and the batting averages. And I just thought that was such a kick. And, Thomas Merton, who was in Gethsemane, he didn't obviously have internet, and I don't know if he was a baseball fan, but he was highly social in his introversion. And in being an introvert, he could really love people. And even at Gethsemane, hospitality was a big thing. And I think that it's a truth that when you find people that live a deeply contemplative life, there's an energy and an other-centeredness that just flows out of them. And, even though the nuns were all women, when I grow up, I want to be like those nuns. To me, that's the embodiment of what it means to be Jesus, to be strong and fierce in such a way where you can withdraw from all the things that would define a good life to seek and find a deeper life, but also a profound tenderness and ability to attune to others. I always felt, though of course I didn't have the word for it when I was young, I always felt like they were dialed into me. I've heard probably more consistently than anyone else that former President Bill Clinton, I know someone who was recently around him, and he goes, I was expecting the magic to be a performance. But when you're around the man, you just feel this charisma. And he said he was in a coffee shop in Mexico, and there was a dog that somebody had brought that was his traveling companion, and Hillary was there too. And he said, I didn't even want this to be true because I don't necessarily like the guy, but he looked into my face and it was like the person before him was the only person in the room. And I think everybody who sees a public figure like that, they go, yeah, okay, I know what that means, though I may not have experienced it. But that's how the nuns were. They were attuned. And I really believe that that came from their life of contemplation and living in rhythms where there could be a spiritual growth that wasn't about performance, but was about being present to presence. You know, the mission statement of the Carmelites is to pray and contemplate the loving mystery of Jesus. Wow, what if you could spend your life doing that?
Yeah, I love that. And I've often heard the same kinds of stories about him. And I think that's the beauty of being seen, isn't it? Whether you know the person, whether you have a relationship with them or not. And I love that you talk about, I've been reading a lot over the last couple of years, the work of Dr. Kurt Thompson, Dan Siegel, and others. And you write about the 4 S's, about being seen, soothed, safe, and secure. And I love the way that you describe them on that kind of 1-sheet page. For seen is your caregiver saying, I get you. For soothed, I've got you. Safe, I've got this. And secure is the idea that love has me. Would you tell us more about those 4 S's?
Yeah, well, as I've been talking about this, I've been talking about it from the first one forward, from seen, I get you forward. I want to work backwards today.
Okay.
So I probably shouldn't keep saying this. My publisher's probably going to eventually write me a letter. I love my publisher, University. But the book at one point was going to be called Love Has You. And the story is that I sent Richard Rohr in 2012 a copy of my book, Surfing for God, because he had really influenced it. He was kind enough to write back a note. And the little benediction sign off where you say, sincerely yours, he wrote, Love has you, comma, Richard. And I, it's a very precious note. But right away I said, that's the name of a book I'm going to write, because that articulates my journey, because I never knew that love has me, and sometimes I still don't trust that. So I use that phrase all throughout the book, but we landed on a different title, which I'm very happy about, because it helps people to understand that the attachment that we have that already exists with God, that we don't have to attain, that we don't have to acquire, that we don't have to perform for, that attachment is there. It's our felt experience of it that's based on our early attachment wounds that allows us to sense or experience it. And that's a paradigm shift for a lot of Christians, right? Because we hear verses like, God turned his face from Jesus in Psalm 22, when in fact, verse 24 of Psalm 22 says, I have not turned away from my servant. I have listened to him. And lots of other passages where we believe, that we're separated from God. And in Christ, we live and move and have our being in him. So it's important to say that this idea that love has us, yes, we are invited to do the work of developing a secure attachment, but the sacred attachment is actually that it's already there, that we are in God's arms, that we are in God's heart, that there is nothing that we can do to make him love us any more or any less. Our brokenness is not a barrier, it's a bridge to living in this belovedness. And I want to say to people that if you have been broken, yes, indeed, you, as your ministry champions, you are beloved, period. And love has you in that sense. And how we get to that reality, to be able to experience that, is that over and over and over again, we discover ourselves and we step into relationships and environments where we are seen, where people say, I get you. I see the deepest parts of who you are, and who you are is welcome. See, what a lot of people might know or experience in their head or their left brain is that love has them, that they are beloved. But there's also this sense that, well, if I don't perform well, or if I'm not, quote, seeking God enough through prayer or Bible study or whatever it is, then he's not going to be happy with me. And my definition of intimacy or attachment is that all of me welcomes all of you, and all of you welcomes all of me. But after being a therapist for 32 years, licensed in Colorado, I've met very few people in and outside of therapy who have a sense that I can really be me in relationship to you. I've got to become bigger than I am, or I've got to become smaller than I am in one way, shape, or form. And I know that a lot of people that come across your ministry have not been able to be who they are. And when they've either stood against the power over them or the control or the abuse, they've paid for it greatly. And so the one place where we can fall into this sense where it is good to be me is in the safety of God. But remembering that a lot of times, despite the abuse that we might have experienced, the misteaching of Scripture that was harmful, the toxic images of God and community, those things are present-day wounds, but the attachment issue is always related in the early wounds. And then in the trauma of our body, those present-day wounds of spiritual abuse and the old wounds all get mixed into the same pot. And it gets mixed together, and it's hard to determine what's what. And so in therapy or in soul care or in the outstanding coaching programs that you do with folks and in your cohorts, sometimes we have to start in the present day and learn to be grounded in the present. Sometimes we need to go back, but we always need to have this felt sense of safety in our body before we can really begin to do any of this work.
Yeah, that's so important. And I love that idea of recognizing where we are now and also recognizing how much of our past story informs and affects the way that we react today, right?
Yes.
So we keep talking about attachment. Let's go there. I've been doing a lot of learning about this for the last couple of years from Attachment Trauma Network, Crispin Mayfield, Jeff Vincent Holzclaw, I know Chuck DeGroat, many others. Tell us your version, and you do this in the book as well, obviously, but what is attachment? How does it work? Why is it important?
You know, it's fascinating because I've both had people on my podcast recently, and I've been on other podcasts where everybody asks me this question, and I have different answers on different days. But the first thing is that attachment is not simply an attachment style. When people say, "Oh yeah, I know about attachment. I read a book about that. I'm an ambivalent attachment, or I'm anxious, or I'm avoidant, or I'm secure," that's kind of like saying, "What color is your car?"
Mm-hmm.
Right? Or what brand of car do you drive? I drive a Toyota or a Ford. But what attachment is a process that is meant to happen from infancy all the way through life, womb to tomb, as Sue Johnson, the emotionally focused late great therapist, taught us. But the critical stages are about 0 to 4 in terms of brain development and how rapidly it happens. And there's a relationship that happens between that infant and the caregiver. I would say mother and father, but for many listeners, it's not a mother and father. It might have been another caregiver, a grandparent, an aunt and uncle, a foster parent, or an adoptive parent. And that parent attunes to the child. They're dialing in. Their body is sensing and seeing that infant there, and that parent is coming for them. Because you mentioned Kurt earlier, and I like to take bets with people sometimes. You know, how long will we go into the conversation before we bring up Kurt Thompson's name and quote him, because he's had such a profound effect in my life as well as being a friend. But it's this relationship where, as Kurt says, all of us come into the world looking for someone looking for us. So the infant has no cognitive construct that there is a grown-up named mom or dad that's going to come and feed me when I'm hungry. But on a sensory level, they are looking for someone looking for them. So the seeing is the very first part. And the parent at a very macro level has to actually see that this child is utterly dependent, that every need of theirs has to be met by the parent. And I used to work in an inner city homeless shelter as a director of counseling. And so we would have some interactions with inner city high school programs, and there were high school girls that were pregnant at age 10, or not 10, 12, 13, 14, and into high school. And they would do these programs where they would have the teenage girl carry a rubber infant around for the week. And eventually they came to have like sensors in them where they would cry, and teachers could set off different kinds of symptoms. And they had to teach these young girls how to attune to them because they hadn't been attuned to, which I find really, really fascinating. There's probably a lot of parents that are in their 20s and 30s that may actually need to have that kind of training. And, you know, I wasn't fully equipped in that way. And so as the parent comes for that infant and attends to them, hears their cry, sees that they're cold, sees the discoloration in the face and that they have a rash, changes their diaper, all of those seemingly normal things, that begins to build a neural circuit in that child that love comes for me. Oh, love has me, even though that child doesn't know the word love or certainly the 4 Greek words for love or anything like that. And that begins to build this neural network that helps the child to do 2 things. And this is out of Dan Siegel and Kurt as well. Number 1, to organize their world, to begin to sense and make sense of the world around them. which means that cause and effect begins to happen. When they drop their food off of the high chair, that maybe mom and dad laugh the first couple of times, but when they do it 10 times in a row at age 1.5, that they start to get a little frustrated. Oh, I have power. There's a cause and effect here. And again, it's so important. The way that God made us in the complexity and magnificence of the human body is that infant still doesn't understand, anything like passive aggressiveness, but it's just this neurological reflex that's there. Now, if that infant is not attuned to, then the neural circuitry for cause and effect becomes diminished. And this is a little bit different language than what some of the attachment therapists talk about. But in psychology, they talk about a term called locus of control. And it's one of the most well-researched psychological concepts going back into the 1950s in the behavioral model. And locus of control is I either operate on the world with effectiveness or the world operates on me. I can step into the world with cause and things happen. Or I wake up in the morning and I'm kind of a victim and powerless and the world just operates on me. And I was a person, though I was successful on the outside, internally, I had an external locus of control because that's the family that I grew up in and because I did not have a secure attachment. So that's the organization part. And as that child grows older, obvious things like I can have homework and be disciplined and sit down and pay attention to that and follow through. Why? Because the other part of the attachment process, one side is organize, the other side is regulate. When the parent attunes to the child and the child is anxious and crying, eventually, and anybody who's had an infant knows this, where they're crying and they kind of heave and they're crying and they catch their breath. I'm sure this is really enjoyable to people when I'm making this sound. And then they go, ah. And it's one of the most joyful sounds in the world to hear an infant that's in distress to exhale, not because that negative stimulation is gone from the ears, because it's just a delightful, like primal sound that, it's like middle C. It's just beautiful. And in that exhaling, a neural circuitry develops where that child not only says love is coming, but I can love myself and I can begin to soothe myself through breathing, through rubbing my two hands together, through touching a soft toy or something like that. And then as that soothing happens, that child will be less anxious because they can depend upon the fact that care will come and that their needs are not shameful or bad, but their needs and their vulnerability is actually a good thing. Now, the person that doesn't get that and they don't have that capacity of being regulated by another, they will have a very difficult time learning how to regulate. They will be much more likely to be anxious. They'll be much more likely to have a variety of addictions, and especially what we call substance kinds of addictions. And it becomes problematic later in life. So you add in a little bit of trauma or a little bit of abuse, and then it just becomes, again, that boiling pot of neurology that is not at rest, that is not still.
Yeah, that's so important. And I appreciate that you say that attachment is not just a style, because I feel like the more people are learning about it, it becomes just another assessment or another informational point of, oh, this is my Enneagram type. This is my Myers-Briggs. This is my attachment style. And then it goes no further.
Right.
And then they just wear it like a badge, or it becomes a defense mechanism. Oh, I can't help it. I just have an anxious attachment style, or I'm just avoidant, so I'm not going to be part of this. So once people figure out what that attachment style is and the way that they relate because of the way that they were brought up, what do we do with that information in a way that's helpful?
Yeah, well, really quickly, I would say that if you look at the anxious attachment, that means that the closer the relationship is, the more likely I am to become anxious about losing that relationship. And therefore, the more likely I am to have to get busy, to perform, to, I'll use an example for me in my ambivalent, which leans toward the anxious side of attachment, of name dropping, and I would say, I don't mean to name drop, but, and then I say the person's name and it's like, I just name dropped. this dialing up, something in my nervous system, my sympathetic nervous system kicks in. I go into a fight or flight mode. And I just want to say, some people go, oh, fight or flight. That's when I'm at a 8, 9, or 10. And that's for people with PTSD. There are a lot of people in ministry and a lot of people in very successful public positions that they're in a fight or flight mode all the time, and they've been that way in their whole life, but it might be at a 3 or a 4 or 5. I might have said this to you in a previous conversation, but I had a therapist for years. He's now 93 years old, Dr. David Donaldson, and he's still practicing therapy. He sees about 10 clients a week. I hope that I can do that when I'm 93. And he said to me once, Michael, do you know the difference between adrenaline and energy? And I looked at him like he was speaking Greek. And I was like, well, isn't all energy adrenaline? And he gave me a book, and I read about adrenaline. And what I realized was I had been living my whole life at a 3 or 4 out of a scale of 10 at this low to moderate level of anxiety. And if you had asked me, am I an anxious person? No, I'm not an anxious person. Struggle with depression. But I had this intense Robin Williams-like personality. I can still flip that switch, and that's a part of who I am. Friends would say that Michael is restless, that I'm never still, that I'm always looking for the next big event, the next mountain to climb, the next thing to accomplish. And that was part of my anxious attachment on the one side of the avoidant attachment. And it's important to know what level of energy is in me that is not actually energy, but adrenaline or cortisol. And so for high achievers, I just sometimes say, let's assume that you have some kind of addiction to adrenaline or to cortisol in your system. And just because you have that energy doesn't mean that God is calling you to do something.
That's important.
On the other side, the avoidant attachment, and I understand that, if some attachment experts are listening to this, they might say, well, this is not exactly true. So this is a generality that in anxiety and anxious attachment, something dials up. Conversely, something dials down. And I just think of the old-fashioned radio knobs on our car, that we can turn the volume up and the volume down. And in an avoidant attachment, my energy for relationship is dialed down. And it's not like a schizoid personality where I simply don't need or have interest in relationship, but it's that as I get closer to others and the more that relationship becomes intimate and therefore requires vulnerability, the more I am to become guarded, the less likely I am to share deep parts of myself. And in that dialing down, I might become someone who, if you ask me what I feel, I might say, I don't know. Or I might say things like, frustrated, for one half of the equation, and on the other side, excited. For a lot of guys, and I'm a guy, so I'm not bashing guys, that's kind of the continuum, but they don't have anything in between. And so in the old days of my therapy, 20 to 30 years ago, I would give people feelings wheels and try to educate them about that. And that can be helpful, but I would expect them to then be able to have the feelings because they had this information. But I think that one of the things I believe is that information doesn't bring transformation. Only encounter and experience brings transformation. But as I begin to learn about the body, even in some of the pre-neuroscience days, it was like, oh, there's something in this person that's been dialed down based on their life experience that they just can't feel. They can't just go, oh, happy is the word, or euphoric, or delighted. They just didn't have that experience. And so what they needed was safety to move into that. Then you have the ambivalent attachment style, which is both together, but then many people speak instead of ambivalent as a disorganized attachment style. And that's where there was some kind of trauma along the way in the development that interrupted the attachment. And where we use the word ambivalent, the word disorganized typically presumes a deeper level of attachment struggle than just the normal coming and going or dialing up and dialing down. And back in the day, and what was fueling my sexual addiction and my alcoholism was a disorganized attachment that on the surface is ambivalent in terms of there's anxiousness, there's avoidance, but I didn't know what to do in relationship. I didn't have a category for understanding intimacy. So in high school, I was attracted to girls, but I was literally terrified to ask out a girl or to go to a homecoming dance or the prom, and therefore I didn't, because I had no idea how to relate in a way like that. And that was my attachment style.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that with us. That's a lot of good information, I think, for people to help not just fit into a category, because that's not what we're trying to do, but to recognize these survival mechanisms and strategies that we've put in place
Yes.
because of the stories of our lives, so that we know how to become aware of how we dial up or dial down, or just are scanning all the channels, because it's so unpredictable. We don't know what comes next. I love that you said earlier that our brokenness is not a barrier, but a bridge.
Yeah.
And you talk about the delta variable, right? The gap between the promises of the gospel and our actual lived reality,
Yes.
or the disconnect between what we believe or believed versus what we've actually experienced. Tell us more about that gap and how we bridge it.
Well, this Friday morning, I actually am going to have a podcast conversation with my mentor and friend, Dr. Dan Allender. We're going to talk about his new book. And he said something to me in 1994 as we were driving together, coming back from a meeting for the old journal, the Mars Hill Review. No relation to Mars Hill Church, but it was what became the Seattle School. And we were talking about back then what we discussed as the Christian ghetto. And that was in 1995. And one of the few writers that was talking about the disillusionment with Christianity as we have done it, the detachment from the soul, the interior life, from social justice, from advocating for the oppressed and the broken, was Brian McLaren. And so Brian and Dan and about a handful of others did this conference that's probably unheard of now, called Out of the Christian Ghetto. And as we were talking about this conference, Dan said, Michael, Christians are sick and tired of being sold a bill of goods. And something inside of me went, yes, because that had been my experience and still was my experience during that time. And I was beginning to learn a different language, but it was so permission giving because I felt like I was given a bill of goods. Like there was this promise that this beautiful delivery, this beautiful package called the abundant Christian life is coming. But internally, I was anxious, ashamed, addicted, disorganized in my attachment style. And I could perform well for a little bit, but alone, I was a really, really broken guy.
Mm-hmm.
And so this delta is just a way of describing that the way that we feel like we've been sold a bill of goods. Where is the abundant life? Where is the joy? Where is the community? Where is the safety and belonging? Much less where are the miracles and things like that. And I think where the miracles are today sometimes happens when hope slowly rises up in people that have lost hope because of wounding and because of abuse and mistreatment in the church and in other contexts. And moment by moment, day by day, week by week, month by month, year by year, as in my story, hope comes back, revival begins to happen within an individual soul. And by revival, I'm not talking about Charles Finney or George Whitefield kind of revival, like let's all praise Jesus. I'm talking about like a heart that has stopped beating and the doctors put the paddles on them and it starts to come back to life and the blood starts to flow and the color starts to come back in. And when you have that kind of experience, a death of sorts, life can take on a whole new meaning, as many people know. So the delta in science is the triangle, is the Greek letter for delta, and that scientific definition is this gap between the goal and the outcome. But a delta is also the delta of a river. And that's the idea, back to your point or question about the brokenness is not a barrier, but a bridge, because the river delta is two different things coming together. So my shame and my belovedness, those are two different things. But when we bring our shame, we discover that shame is a lie, that it's something that's been put upon us, that it's not God who shames us. And I could go on for 15 minutes, literally quoting all the scriptures that say that we're not ashamed, that we should not be ashamed. I pray every morning in a liturgy, Psalm 25 verse 2 and 3, that says, do not let me be put to shame or let my enemies triumph over me. No one whose hope in you will ever be put to shame. Wow. When we preach a gospel that calls us to perform, and when we don't measure up, we are to feel shame, or when we preach a gospel that if you do certain things that you should be ashamed and you will be shamed, that's a gospel that's not the gospel that God talks about. It's not the gospel that David talked about. It's not the gospel that Paul talked about in Romans 10 when it says, if you confess with your mouth and believe in your heart that Jesus is Lord, you'll be saved. Everybody stops there and nobody reads the next sentence. For those who believe in his name will never be put to shame. And I believe, Brian, that the effect of the gospel, the effect of this life of good news, that love has us, that we are embraced, that God is infinite in his mercy, that everyone is welcome at the table. The effect of that good news is that we would live without shame, that we would go right back to Genesis 2:25, that we'd be able to be naked and unashamed, to be fully known, which is the essence of nakedness. And in that fully knownness, which is intense vulnerability, that there we would discover that we are beloved. And it's exactly at that moment where the brokenness becomes the bridge and where we discover what we've been looking for all of our life. And it's important to say, in no way, shape, or form does God cause that brokenness. God is not the author of suffering. God is the redeemer of suffering. Suffering is just a part of life. In the Serenity Prayer, the second half, it says, the first half, everybody knows, God grant me the serenity to accept the things I can't change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And then there's a second half of that Reinhold Niebuhr wrote. And one of the lines is, accepting hardship as the pathway to peace and taking the sinful world as God did, not as I would have it, but as it is. And so our brokenness is something that we lament, especially in spiritual abuse situations. It's something that we grieve over and that we feel sorrow. And as 2 Corinthians 7 talks about, we discover that there's a kind of sorrow that is leading to life as opposed to a sorrow that leads to death. Or in one translation, it says godly sorrow and worldly sorrow. And I guess the godly sorrow is that which actually generates something and it brings forth life.
Yeah. As an Enneagram 1, I have loved the second half of that Serenity Prayer for so long, and it's been so helpful for me. I love that you share so much about this idea of shame, and yet I recognize for so many people in our community that we carry shame so easily.
Yes.
And like you're saying about that low hum of anxiety that was always at a 3 or a 4, that shame has just become the water that we swim in, that we don't always recognize that it's there.
Yeah.
And you write, what if you could look back on your most painful, shameful moments with compassion and grace rather than self-contempt and rejection? Who would you be? And I love that question. It feels so much like grace. We were talking earlier about Alison Cook, and her work has been so helpful to me. I Shouldn't Feel This Way and all the others. And both she and you offer this idea in the book of when it comes to recognizing those points of shame or self-condemnation, rather than shame, to approach with compassion and just offer this idea of, but of course,
yes,
of course you have this strategy. Of course you've been doing this thing. Tell us more about what we do with the shame we still feel, even knowing that these scriptures have been weaponized sometimes against us. Oh, it's like, oh, well, you're still feeling shame. You must not be praying enough, reading enough, doing enough, holy enough. So when we still feel that or carry that, what do we do with it?
Well, first of all, you can't overcome shame with your left brain. You can't read a Michael Cusick book or an Alison Cook book or a Brene Brown book. All great books, right? Buy 10 of them each. It has to be through encounter with other people. So that's the first thing I would say. I was very intentional in putting a story in Sacred Attachment, which is the story to this day of one of my most shameful moments as a sex addict. And this was just a short time before God intervened in my life, and I was found out and discovered and almost lost my marriage. That was 34 years ago, last July. And the long and short of it, and I will give a very sanitized version, but I had gone to an adult bookstore. This was before the internet and being able to download pornography. And you would get tokens or quarters and put them in this machine and watch pornography. And on this particular day, I went in there and I didn't have any money. But I went into one of these booths to watch pornography. And I knew that people in their desperation or anxiety in these places, that they often drop tokens or quarters on the floor. Well, the floor was filthy and sticky. And I can feel in my body right now, not shame, but like a sense of tingling, like there's still something about this that 30, almost 5 years later, activates me. And I found some tokens and I unfortunately acted out in this place. I was a married man. And about a few months later, as things began to unravel, and as I desperately needed for the very first time in my life, not to believe in my head that God loved me, but to encounter that love. I had a kind of vision, and I saw something in my mind's eye, but it was like it was right before me, and it was just very ordinary. And the vision was, I'm down on my knees in this adult bookstore with a sticky floor, looking for tokens and quarters, and Jesus is there. And he has his arm around me, and he's pulling me in tight, and he's saying, of course, of course. And that changed my life. That was the beginning of how I began to deal with shame. I'm going to do this visual, but I've got my glasses down on the end of my nose like an English schoolmaster from a Dickens novel who is looking down at the student with shame. Jesus, of course, was not, well, of course you flunked the test, Michael, because you're an idiot and you got a 2.2 in college GPA. Instead, it was I know exactly why you're here. And in light of your story of being sexually abused and trafficked through your uncle to other men, in light of all the other abuse and all the addiction and all the ways that this addiction for decades now has numbed you to what's actually there, of course. And the of course included, Michael, of course I know that you hate this. And of course I know that you have no idea how to be free other than to try harder, to do more, to make more promises. And that was the beginning of the end, because that's when I started to realize for the very first time that this God who claimed to love me and that the Christian message that I had heard that he loved me, I believed that, but I sure didn't feel that, because why didn't he stop my sexual abuse? Why couldn't he help me stop this thing that I hated, that I thought that people would despise me for if they knew that I was doing? So in that moment, that was an encounter. And so one of the ways that we deal with shame is we let ourselves be known. And that usually begins in a relationship with another, with a therapist, with a coach like you, just telling people stories, in confessional communities, in therapy groups. But all too often, when we let ourselves be known, that other person, though they may have good intentions, they respond in a way that is shaming, and it makes the problem worse.
Yeah.
I remember the very first time at 20 years old, I told a man that was mentoring me, I said, my brother touched me and we had some sexual contact in a way that I think was really wrong. And I don't know if it's abuse. I don't think it is, because I'm okay today. But I took this risk of letting myself be known. And the person, God bless them, they said, well, you're a new creation in Christ. The old is gone, the new has come. So you just need to trust God and get on with life. And I remember when I heard that, it was like the last nail in the coffin. And eventually, Brian, through all of this delta space that I couldn't close and through the shame that I was carrying, I said to God one Sunday in church, and I was going to church and I hated it, but I went in hopes that somebody would see me and somebody would light up when they saw me just because I was there. And I said to God a prayer that it felt really scary at the time, but I said, God, if this is what Christianity is, I'm not sure I want to be a Christian.
Yeah.
And I think years later, that was a daring, bold, and necessary prayer. Because although I didn't hear God say this in that moment, like the vision, I think God would be saying, yeah, me too. I don't want to be a Christian if this is what it is, because that's never what he intended. Mm-hmm. There's this idea of freedom and wholeness and living with joy that is infinitely better than what we've been offered and taught. And that happens, on one hand, far more simply than we imagine, because it really comes down to trust and rest. Resting, this idea that I can cease striving, as Psalm 46:10 tells us, and just be loved by God and others. I was talking to a person very, very recently in an intensive who's a very, very successful, somewhat well-known leader. And, my hope for this person is that they just be able to be still, and all of the exhaustion and everything can begin to go away. Yes, self-care is important, but putting yourself in situations where you can be loved, and that requires vulnerability. But for anyone that's experienced trauma and abuse, vulnerability is a dangerous thing and a bad thing, when, as we were created in God's image, vulnerability was meant to be a good thing.
Yeah.
That's why we're so drawn to sex, and why as like in my life, sexuality is so compulsive for so many of us because it's the one space where we can find vulnerability, the greatest kind of vulnerability, physical, emotional, relational, potentially spiritual, and it feels safe. Now, afterwards, we might walk away wounded if it's not a generative and edifying sexual connection. But for a moment, that vulnerability feels like we're looking into the face of God.
Yeah.
Sting said, if God has something better than sex, he's surely holding out on us.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing. I mean, that's such a vulnerable story. I just remember it caught my breath and I just had to sit for a few minutes after reading that story in the book. And I'm so grateful you put that in there for us as an example. And there are so many other stories like that throughout, so many other questions I have for you about perfection versus goodness, about the two lies that evil tells us, about all mysticism. But I think the one thing I want us to close with, because I know we're running out of time, is embodiment and the soul. And I love that you write that the soul is designed to experience shalom, not simply peace, but wholeness, integration of the body, mind, emotions, and will. And about this resisting or rejection of a Greek dualism or even Gnosticism, right? Separating the body and the spirit versus a Hebrew concept of the soul that encompasses all of those things. And then you write, restoring our soul requires reconnecting to our bodies. And only as we learn to integrate our bodies within our spirituality can we become whole. We are all about moving people toward healing and wholeness. What does that integration or reintegration and wholeness look like? Like, how do we move toward that?
The most important question of this conversation, right? Because if we are not embodied, we can't experience spirituality. We'll only experience religion or left brain understanding of God. And left brain understanding of God doesn't bring about the fruit of the Spirit. It doesn't bring about joy. It doesn't bring about abundance. A good atheist coach can do that. But to have something that's shifted at the interior, that has to come from embodied spirituality where we're connected to our body. You know, I have to shout out credit for a lot of other people. I gave a 30,000 foot view of embodiment in the book, in the chapter, but it was important to include there people like Hillary McBride, Tara Owens, and, countless others are writing today about embodiment and spirituality. But yeah, your point is so important. I do contrast the Greek understanding of the idea of soul, psyche, from where we get the word psyche. It's also the word self. But in that Greek understanding, the self or the soul is it's just mind, will, and emotions. Some people call that a tripartite understanding of a human being made in the image of God. But what's lacking there is the body. And then you lead into this, the body is bad, physical matter is bad, desire is bad, so suppress it. Well, that's Buddhism, right? The elimination of desire. And that you are to somehow transcend your body. But Christian spirituality, certainly not evangelical Christianity, historic Christian spirituality has always been about the intensification of desire and the integration and the welcoming of the body. And man, oh man, for people that are listening who have experienced spiritual abuse, which I know many or most of your listeners are, as I talk, I'm a clinical therapist, but I also have a pastoral heart, and particularly toward the oppressed, the wounded, the abused, the traumatized. And I just want to say to people that are hearing me speak of Scripture, hopefully I'm putting a different spin on it, and it's a different kind of language. But what I want to say is that if you've lost your taste for Scripture or the story of God between Genesis and Revelation, just be patient and wait, because there will come a time as your attachment becomes more and more secure, and as your spirituality becomes more and more embodied, there will come a time when your eyes will be opened and the scales will fall, and you'll start to see from Genesis to Revelation, oh my gosh, that's what he's talking about. He's talking about attachment. He's talking about this connection. He's talking about safety. There is a person and a place where we can go. And I feel sad for a lot of my secular and non-Christian colleagues because they do wonderful, wonderful work. For example, Dr. Tara Brach, B-R-A-C-H, wrote a book called True Refuge. She's written a lot about models of mindfulness. And she actually existed prior to the proliferation of what we're now talking about, some of the modern trauma ideas. But in her book, True Refuge, it's fascinating. It's like 1 minute short of Christian spirituality, if she just said a little bit more. But she's saying there is this refuge inside of you that you can go to where everything is calm and peaceful. And that is true. That's why Buddhist monks all over the world can live a Zen life. That's why there are people that, they really have a deep sense of presence and groundedness without Jesus. But the idea of the scripture story is founded in relationality. And I believe that the essence of holiness is not moral, meaning God's holiness is that he doesn't break laws or that he's never sinned and that he's untainted. God's holiness is fundamentally relational. Holiness means other. And when you look at relationship within God, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, there's nothing like it. There's this presence, there's a pouring out, there's an attunement to one another. And in that pouring out, there's never a diminishment like so many of us experience. In order to get something, I've got to lose myself. There's never a loss of personhood in that relationality. And so we begin to see that lens in the scriptures, and everything becomes about that. And what I just like to say to people is there's a person, there's a face to God in Jesus. And for people who can't look upon the face of God or Jesus, sometimes we need to look at symbols like icons, or we need to listen to music, and maybe and probably secular music. And I know this is almost cliche, but like sometimes we need to find our spirituality again in the outdoors, or in reading great secular literature to learn that there's this arc of story that is the story of the scriptures, but is woven into everything else that a human being creates, because they can't help but to reflect and somehow create some aspect of that story because they're made in the image of God. And so embodiment, when we're reading the novels, when we are listening to the music, when whatever it is that we're doing, when we're moving kinesthetically, as we attune to our bodies, that opens up space for spirit. It opens up space for attachment. There is no attachment apart from embodiment. And so the most important thing that people can do is begin to pay attention to their bodies.
Yeah.
Dallas Willard said, and maybe I'll end with this if we're wrapping up, the first great act of love is attention.
Yeah.
Giving attention to our body is the first place to start.
I love that. Thank you so much for that. It's such an important part, I'm learning, of the healing process of wherever you are, that, like you're saying, that first act of love is that paying attention. It's like we're so conditioned or primed to ignore and dismiss and deny all of the symptoms and all of the things because we've been gaslit or we've been told that we're wrong or that we've imagined it. And so turning back to yourself to say, actually, and I love that you did that even as you were retelling the story of the adult books, where it's like, it's not the shame, but there's this tingling sensation in my body even 35 years later.
Right.
And for us to notice, like, this story happened to me maybe a long time ago, but I still feel this thing in my body. And being able to attune to that thing and say it out loud, or to share it with someone in hopes that it will be received and safe, right? It does wonders to just know that I don't just have a body, but I am a body. And that wholeness is that move toward integration of that this is all part of me, that this is all part of the way that God created it and meant for it to be. And yes, it's been broken, but we move through that to move toward that wholeness again.
Yes. Yeah. And can I close with a final thought that just ties that together?
Of course.
So I want to come back to this word holiness. And I really attempted in the book to help redeem some language because, anybody with spiritual abuse has heard about holiness as, God is holy and we are not. There's this message in the book of Colossians that's a really beautiful message underneath what appears on the surface. In chapter 3, by a lot of people in the spiritual formation movement that help focus on the interior life, that's a big chapter to people because it talks about how we grow in our interior life. And for years, Brian, all throughout my early life as a Christian, my addiction, my unrecognized and unresolved trauma, I would read Colossians 3 about I'm going to be holy, because the subtitle in, the publishers, not the authors of the Bible, but the publishers put in rules for holy living. Well, I'm a rules guy. So give me the rules and I'm going to be holy. And I read books on holiness, but I would go over and I memorized part of Colossians chapter 3. And the part I would over and over and over, set your heart on things above, your mind on things above, and understand what it means to be hidden in Christ. And then it talked about putting off the old self and putting on the new self. And I read books about that. And I tried to do it, and it never happened because I was still addicted to sex. And I would drink myself numb on the lunch hour while I worked at a mental health substance abuse clinic. Isn't that ironic? And I lied to my wife, and I became somebody I didn't want to become despite doing that. And 5 years ago, I read the next verse. And someday maybe you and I should write a book called The Next Verse, because I think that the next verse helps a lot of people that go, that I've been sold a bill of goods. The next verse in Colossians 3:12 says, after all of these, quote, rules for holy living, therefore, comma, you who are holy, chosen, and dearly loved, clothe yourself with compassion, humility, kindness, gentleness, and patience. And over all of these, put on love. So if someone wants to be holy, I would say that's the same thing as becoming whole. And I would predict that all of your listeners, unless they accidentally landed on this podcast, that they all want to be whole. How do you do that? You clothe yourself with compassion, kindness, gentleness, patience, and humility, because your Creator, your God, who is pure mercy, infinite mercy, He gives you that compassion, kindness, gentleness, patience. And then to clothe yourself with humility. And a lot of spiritually abused people like me have been taught a bill of goods about humility. I learned that humility is thinking less of yourself, not biblical, not from God. Then I heard that humility is thinking of yourself less. Okay? Any listener, on the count of 3, try to think of yourself less, and you'll actually think of yourself more. What humility is, and I love Thomas Merton's definition, humility is being precisely the person that you actually are at any given time before God and maybe one other person. So wouldn't it be wonderful if the foundation of our faith is love has you, and your work in this broken world each and every day, when you can, is to clothe yourself with compassion and just letting yourself be precisely who you are at any given moment, trusting that you are loved, and to do that with gentleness and patience. And the person who does that will wake up one day and say, wow, I feel a sense of security and quiet and calm and contentment inside of myself. I don't know how it got there, but all those therapy and all those Broken to Beloved podcasts, that must be adding up to something. And I'm a different person. And that is the resurrection that we celebrate and remember on Easter Sunday out of the Good Fridays and the Holy Saturdays that so many of us have lived and are just waiting for that hope.
Yeah. Michael, what a gift this conversation has been. And hopefully as we move toward holiness and wholeness, recognizing and reclaiming that love has you, that we'll find that. Thank you so much for your time. Everyone go get a copy of Sacred Attachment wherever books are sold. We'll have all the links in the show notes. Michael, thank you so much.
So good to be with you.
What a redemptive conversation. I am so grateful for Michael and his work and his gentle and gracious, compassionate approach to the gospel in a way that recognizes the ways that it's been weaponized and used to harm people and draws us in to see ourselves more clearly in the way that we've lived our stories, in the ways that we've grown up, and to move back towards that integrity and wholeness. If you enjoyed the conversation as much as I did, be sure to follow Michael and say thanks for being on the show. You can find links and all the things in the show notes. Next time, we'll be talking with Melissa Hogan. She's an attorney who's done lots of work in the area of spiritual abuse. Subscribe or follow the show to get new episodes automatically. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a rating and review or share with your friends. As a 501c3 nonprofit, our work is made possible by our generous donors. We are hoping to reach our goal of $5,000 with monthly donations. And if this has been helpful to you, would you consider joining us today with maybe just $10 or $20 a month? You can support us at brokentobeloved.org/support. Thanks so much for taking the time out of your day to listen. I hope it's been helpful. Here's to moving toward healing and wholeness together. I'll see you next time.